Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we have, well, quite an incredible challenge laid out before us. We're aiming to synthesize a massive body of knowledge. It really spans the entirety of human history, right from the moment we first controlled fire, all the way to complex mathematical modeling of ecosystem survival. So we're tackling these fundamental concepts: innovation, adaptation, and sustained viability.
It is ambitious, definitely, a real deep dive. When you stack sources about, say, the primitive ignition of fire right next to research on population viability analysis, or PVA, well, you start looking for the universals, don't you? What are those core mechanisms, the ones that allow any system, could be a climate, a skyscraper, a species, to actually transform and crucially endure?
Exactly. And for you, the learner listening in, we really want this to be the definitive shortcut. We're going to distill the absolute essence of all this material. We'll move quickly, yes, but thoroughly through 5 core areas. First, the foundations of human progress. Then, the tools we use to understand history and language. Third, how we design for survival. Fourth, the biology of specialization. And finally, that really complex challenge of sustainability, looking across both ecology and economy.
Yeah, we're aiming to give you the blueprint, so to speak, for transformation itself, but across multiple dimensions. It should be fascinating.
Okay, let's jump straight in then, right at the beginning of civilization itself. So our sources, they rightly describe the mastery of fire as, well, the ultimate technological revolution. I mean, it wasn't just stumbling onto something useful, it was a fundamental transformation of what it even meant to be human. And it all hinged, didn't it, on understanding a single core mechanism. How do you achieve reliable ignition?
That really is the crux of it. We often simplify it, in our heads. But the ability to reliably produce combustion, that was the absolute pinnacle of early engineering. You had to understand the principles of friction, maybe using something like a bow drill, or mastering that specific strike of flint against, say, iron pyrite to generate that crucial spark. It wasn't easy.
And once you had that spark, the reward was just immense. Combustion releases this massive thermal energy, which then spreads out via radiation. And that radiation, that warmth and light, it became a shared resource, a central point.
The profound shift, though, wasn't just physical, it was social. Definitely social. Fire allowed early humans to actually venture into environments they couldn't possibly have survived before. Think about northern climates. It was the ultimate catalyst for progress, really ensuring our existence and our endurance in much harsher temperate zones. And critically, as you mentioned, it extended the working day. It also created the first sort of centralized social space. It essentially ended up domesticating human behavior right alongside the element itself.
Right, and this is where adaptation takes a massive leap forward, isn't it? How did fire use fundamentally change human biology?
Well, the primary biological adaptation seems to have been driven by diet. Cooked food is significantly easier to digest, there's no question. It breaks down complex starches, proteins, requires much less energy for digestion. And our sources actually link this caloric efficiency directly to neurological evolution. By freeing up that metabolic energy, the energy previously used just for heavy digestion, well, more energy could then be allocated to brain development and maintenance. Learning to harness fire was, in essence, outsourcing a biological process to a tool.
That's a great way to put it. And that concept of resource management, it becomes apparent even right here in this primitive context. You see that shift from a stage of scarcity to one of abundance.
Absolutely. You can imagine, initially, if you lived in a damp environment, just maintaining a fire would be incredibly difficult. Constant vigilance, very selective fuel choice. It would define your movement patterns. That's a state of scarcity. But once the techniques of fire making, and maybe just as importantly, fuel extraction, became efficient, allowing for longer, controlled burns, well, then you reached a state of abundance.
And abundance, that allows for the next great transformation, doesn't it?
Precisely. Long-lasting fires, they allowed for more permanent settlement. They allowed for hardening tools, pottery, eventually clearing land for agriculture. The ability to control thermal energy, it became the prerequisite for pretty much all future resource control. It directly links the fate of that first campfire to the massive industrial systems we manage today. It really set the precedent. Overcoming a challenge through innovation leads to a new reality, but often it creates a new dependency too.
Right. So to understand that ancient history, all those transformations, we need the right methodological tools. And that brings us squarely to archaeology, which is, the systematic study of human history and prehistory, mostly through excavation and the careful analysis of material culture. If fire was that ancient engine of progress, you could say archaeology is the modern engine of inference. trying to piece it all together.
Okay, so when we talk about finding, say, an ancient fire pit, how do archaeologists actually move from just a hole in the ground, maybe some burnt material, to a concrete statement about the year that fire was used? What gives the date scientific authenticity? Well, it relies on layers of proof, really, starting with chronology. The initial analysis often uses stratigraphy. That's the study of layered deposits, or strata. When an archaeologist performs an excavation, they meticulously record these layers. The basic principle is the deeper the layer of sediment, the relatively older the artifact found within it is likely to be. This gives us the relative timeline.
Okay, so relative. We know which object came before which, roughly, but not the actual calendar date.
Exactly. To get closer to an absolute date, we turn to specific scientific tools like radiocarbon dating. This method measures the decay of carbon-14, which is a radioactive isotope, in any organic materials found in that layer. So things like charcoal from the fire itself, maybe bone fragments, preserved wood. By combining the relative chronology you get from stratigraphy with the absolute dating estimates from radiocarbon, we build a much more rigorous and crucially contextual picture.
The sources really emphasize that term, contextual analysis. Why is that specific word so critical in archaeology?
Because without context, an object is, well, it's just a curiosity. It doesn't tell you much. If we find a specific type of seashell, say 500 miles inland, where it clearly doesn't belong naturally, it's the contextual analysis, its provenance, where exactly it was found, its correlation to other items found with it that allows us to form a reliable hypothesis about past human life. For instance, it could help establish ancient trade routes or maybe understand cultural influence or movement. The entire process of archaeology is really about building reliable inferences from often incomplete physical evidence.
Okay, now if we take that same methodical approach, that need for context and rigorous analysis, and pivot to something completely different, something non-physical like the spoken word, we see a fascinating parallel, don't we? How do linguists apply a similar kind of rigor to the, well, ephemeral nature of conversation? It just disappears once it's said.
Right, it's a great comparison. We shift our focus from digging up earth to compiling a corpus, or rather, corpora. Instead of artifacts, we're gathering massive, structured collections of spoken or written texts, often these days recorded conversations. These collections are absolutely essential for analyzing how language is actually used in real life, rather than just how, grammar books say it should be used.
And the challenge there, I imagine, must be converting the incredible messiness of real speech, the pauses, the ums, the overlaps, into data that you can actually analyze systematically.
Oh, it's highly technical. Extremely. The first step is transcription, converting the audio recording into written text. And a good transcription has to capture everything, every word, every hesitation, every pause. But the second step, which is arguably even more crucial for analysis, is annotation. This involves adding layers of analytical markup tags that capture things the words alone don't show, like nonverbal details inferred from the sound, the social context, speaker intent, turn-taking structure.
Why can't we just read the transcript, though? I mean, if I read the words, "you were coming," right, I understand them. What's missing?
Because the text alone completely ignores the entire mechanism of spoken discourse. Think about that very sentence. You are coming, right. If the prosody, that's the intonation, the rhythm, the stress patterns, if it's flat, it's probably just a standard question seeking confirmation. But if the pitch rises sharply on the word right, it might suggest surprise, maybe even desperation. If it falls sharply, it could imply expectation, perhaps even a veiled command. Prosody carries this huge emotional and functional layer that transcription by itself just cannot capture.
Okay. So the meaning we get is derived from much, much more than just the dictionary definitions of the words.
Precisely. And that leads us straight to the distinction between semantics and pragmatics. Semantics is basically the dictionary definition of a word or phrase, the literal meaning. Pragmatics, on the other hand, is the meaning in context, the intended meaning. So if I ask, can you pass the salt? Semantically, I'm asking about your physical ability to do so. But pragmatically, everyone understands it as a request for action. Please pass the salt. Spoken language is absolutely defined by these informal elements, colloquialism or slang, ellipsis, where we omit words the listener can easily fill in, and that crucial social structure of turn-taking and conversational overlap. Analyzing a real conversation requires understanding that these overlaps, these pauses, these ums and ahs, are often more informative about the interaction than a perfectly formed written utterance would be.
So it seems whether we're trying to establish the timeline of a piece of ancient flint based on its layer in the earth, or interpret a potentially sarcastic intonation in a modern spoken corpus, the underlying mission is actually the same. It's all about applying systematic tools to achieve verifiable contextualization. understanding not just the what, but the how and why within its specific setting. Okay, let's transition now from the tools we use to analyze structures, whether linguistic or archaeological, to the physical structures themselves. Modern engineering represents maybe an extreme case of innovation-driven design, particularly when you look at maximizing space through verticality. Going up.
Oh, absolutely. The skyscraper is, in many ways, a testament to overcoming gravity. When you decide to push a structure, 1,000 feet or more into the air, the initial design challenges move way beyond simple construction. They become almost existential physics problems. The number one requirement, without a doubt, is the foundation. It has to anchor the entire building securely, often down to stable bedrock, and it needs to manage the sheer unimaginable weight, the load of the structure pressing down from above.
Right. And once that foundation is laid, how do engineers make sure the whole thing doesn't just, wobble in the wind or collapse under lateral forces?
Yeah, wind load is huge. That requires immense reinforcement and just absolute uncompromising structural integrity. Engineers have to anticipate every possible external stressor, wind, seismic activity, and internal ones too, like the building's own weight distribution. For example, a key architectural element you often see is the cantilever structure. Think of a projecting balcony or a section of a floor that extends outwards, supported only at one end. Designing that requires a deep understanding of opposing forces. The internal tension within the structure has to perfectly balance the external load trying to pull it down. The detailed blueprint is where the engineer calculates all these forces precisely. It ensures that even elements like internal load-bearing walls are integrated perfectly into the overall frame, contributing to the building's durability and stiffness.
And beyond just the sheer framework, the skeleton of the building, how does high-rise architecture manage basic human needs in such an extreme form of urban density?
Well, the functional requirements inside are massive logistical feats in themselves. You need incredibly high-speed elevator systems capable of moving thousands of people efficiently every day. You need robust, complex ventilation systems, HVAC, that cycle fresh air throughout hundreds of floors. Achieving that high level of function while also maintaining the desired aesthetic appeal, creating a compelling shape on the skyline that's really the definition of modern architectural mastery, its form and function at an extreme scale.
Okay, now let's consider the radical opposite. Instead of building ever taller, we look at potentially reducing urban sprawl by digging down, subterranean housing. And this isn't just some, novelty concept for hobbits. This seems driven by a really deep commitment to sustainability.
It is. It's a complete inversion of the skyscraper model, absolutely. And its sustainability argument is actually quite compelling. The core idea is that subterranean or earth-sheltered homes utilize the earth itself as natural insulation. The ground, just a few feet down, maintains a relatively constant temperature year-round, regardless of the weather up top. This drastically minimizes the temperature differential between the inside of the house and the outside environment.
I find those passive heating and cooling mechanisms just fascinating. Can you tell us a bit more about the concept of thermal mass? How does that work?
Right. Thermal mass is a key principle here. It's the ability of heavy, dense materials like concrete, stone, brick, or, in this case, the surrounding earth itself, to absorb, store, and then slowly release heat energy. Think of a natural cave. In the middle of summer, the cave stays wonderfully cool because the massive amount of earth around it absorbs the heat filtering down. In the winter, that same earth slowly radiates some of its stored residual heat back into the structure. This naturally regulates the internal climate, significantly reducing the energy needed for heating and air conditioning systems. Many advanced designs also leverage geothermal heat pumps, actively exchanging heat with the stable temperature of the ground for even greater efficiency.
Okay, but burying a house must introduce some really serious engineering challenges that are quite different from a standard above-ground home build.
Oh, absolutely. Big challenges. The first hurdle is the excavation itself, which needs to be planned meticulously to ensure stability. But then you face the eternal enemy of anything underground: water. Unlike a skyscraper, which is designed to shed water efficiently, a subterranean home is constantly surrounded by moisture in the ground. So you must have an incredibly robust, complete, impermeable moisture barrier, often heavy plastic membranes or specialized coatings on every single exterior wall and surface below ground level to prevent seepage.
And what about actual flooding? Or just surface water runoff finding its way down?
Proper drainage is absolutely non-negotiable. You can't skimp on it. This usually involves things like perimeter drains, gravel backfill, and grading the landscape to funnel water away from the structure before it can build up pressure against the walls. Furthermore, because these spaces are often very well sealed to maximize thermal performance, maintaining good air quality becomes critical. You need advanced ventilation systems, often heat recovery ventilators, HRVs, not just to bring in fresh oxygen, but also to control indoor humidity and mitigate the potential buildup of things like radon gas seeping from the soil or other indoor pollutants. So, interestingly, both the sky-high innovation of the skyscraper and the deep-dug design of the subterranean home are ultimately seeking the same things: maximum operational efficiency and long-term structural endurance within their very different chosen environments. We've just talked about the structural integrity needed for a building to endure. Now let's shift that focus to the structural or maybe biological integrity of the human brain and body, and we can begin with something quite fundamental: laterality. That's the common preference for using one side of the body over the other, which typically leads to physical dominance of that side, like being right-handed or left-handed.
Right, we tend to think of handedness as just, a personal quirk. But it actually reflects some really deep-seated neurological processes, doesn't it? It's not random.
Not at all. It reflects a significant asymmetry in how our brain functions. While the two cerebral hemispheres generally handle the opposite sides of the body for motor control and sensation, there's a lot of specialization involved. In roughly 90% of the population, it's the left hemisphere that is dominant. It controls the right side of the body, and critically, it typically houses the core centers for language acquisition and processing. This strong genetic predisposition seems to be the primary driver behind handedness for most people.
So the brain is actively specializing, dividing tasks between the hemispheres, presumably to achieve better efficiency in complex motor skills.
Precisely. That specialization creates proficiency. The dominant hand, the one controlled by the dominant hemisphere for fine motor tasks, becomes the expert in precise manipulation. Everything from wielding a tool, maybe that piece of flint back in ancient times, to writing with a pen today. This asymmetry appears to be an evolutionary advantage, allowing for higher levels of skill. And while we often hear people described as ambidextrous if they use both hands for different tasks, true ambidexterity, where both hands possess genuinely equal proficiency for fine, complex tasks, is statistically very rare. It's worth noting, though, that our current understanding of laterality still contains significant ambiguity. There's ongoing debate about the exact interplay between genetic factors and environmental influences, and the precise constraint mechanisms aren't fully mapped out.
Okay. That focus on specialization for efficiency and pushing innate limits leads us perfectly into the topic of human endurance and athletic adaptation. This really is where the body manages its internal resources, almost like our ancient ancestors managing their wood supply for a fire, but on a metabolic level.
It's the ultimate metabolic resource management problem, isn't it? We typically define performance capabilities through two core physiological mechanisms, or energy systems. You have aerobic activity, which requires a steady supply of oxygen to fuel sustained, lower-intensity effort over longer periods, think jogging. And then you have anaerobic activity, which relies on energy stored directly within the muscles for short, intense, explosive efforts like sprinting or heavy lifting, which can happen without needing immediate oxygen input, but it can't last long.
Right. So when a marathon runner famously hits the wall, what is physically happening inside their body at that moment?
The wall. That's typically the point where the body's most easily accessible energy source, which is glycogen, essentially stored carbohydrates in the muscles, and liver, becomes significantly depleted. For continued endurance beyond that point, the athlete's system must transition rapidly and efficiently to relying much more heavily on fat metabolism, also known as fat oxidation. This process breaks down stored body fat lipid for energy. Now, the athlete who achieves high efficiency in this specific metabolic shift, the ability to tap into and burn fat effectively while still moving at pace, gains a huge competitive edge. If they can oxidize fat faster and more readily, they can sustain their effort for longer before fatiguing.
So how do sports scientists actually measure that capacity for sustained aerobic performance? What are the key metrics?
Well, one of the benchmark measures they look at is VO2 max. That stands for maximal oxygen uptake, and it's the maximum rate at which an individual's body can take in and utilize oxygen during intense exercise. A higher VO2 max generally indicates a superior aerobic engine, better oxygen delivery, and utilization efficiency. But performance isn't just about peak capacity. The body's long-term adaptation to training and its resilience against prolonged fatigue during an event is also heavily dictated by things like hormonal balance. Hormones regulate metabolism, stress response, tissue repair, everything. When that delicate hormonal balance is maintained under stress, the body can perform closer to its physiological threshold for longer periods. It really illustrates that the internal biochemical resilience of the body is just as vital as the external reinforcement we talked about in architecture. Which brings us nicely to the overarching principle connecting all these mechanisms: viability, just the fundamental ability to survive and thrive long term. And now we turn to complex systems where that viability is often under severe constant threat. Let's start with conservation biology. Here, a key analytical tool they use is something called population viability analysis, or PVA.
PVA. That term itself sounds quite high stakes, almost like a predictive science for survival. What exactly is the application of PVA? How is it used?
It is high stakes, definitely. PVA is essentially a crucial quantitative technique. It uses mathematical modeling, simulation, and available empirical data on a species to model its likely population dynamics over time. Its main goal is usually to calculate long-term projections and estimate the extinction risk for a particular species or population over a specific time frame, say the next 50 or 100 years. So it functions as a critical adaptive management tool. It helps conservation managers understand the risks and prioritize which conservation actions might be most effective.
Okay, so what are the biggest factors, the key parameters that these PVA models have to account for when they're trying to predict survival or extinction?
Well, the models absolutely have to contend with stochasticity, which basically just means randomness or unpredictable variation. The critical threats generally fall into two main categories. First, there's demographic stochasticity. These are the random year-to-year fluctuations in birth rates, death rates, and the sex ratio of offspring, just due to chance events affecting individuals. Now, if a population is large, say 10,000 individuals, a few accidental deaths, or a slightly skewed sex ratio in 1 year doesn't really matter much. But if the population is tiny, maybe only 50 individuals, then just one unlucky event, like a single predator being successful or an unexpected illness hitting a few key breeders, represents a huge percentage loss. This dramatically increases the short-term extinction risk. The second category is environmental variability. These are random events that affect the entire population or large parts of it, simultaneously things like wildfires, droughts, floods, or major disease outbreaks.
Right. And what about the internal threats? Threats arising from within the species' own biology when populations get small.
Yes, that's the significant risk posed by low genetic diversity. Small, isolated populations inevitably have higher levels of inbreeding over time. Mating between related individuals. Inbreeding reduces the overall genetic variation within the population, which can lower their adaptability to future environmental changes and decrease their resilience against new diseases or parasites. So the PVA model, trying to integrate all of these factors, the demographic randomness, the environmental shocks, and the genetic risks to assess how much combined stress a particular species or population can likely endure before it spirals towards extinction, a point of non-recovery.
So understanding these risks, particularly the problem of habitat fragmentation, must lead directly to potential solutions then.
Absolutely. And one of the primary practical solutions derive from understanding fragmentation, which is where continuous habitats get broken up into smaller, isolated patches, usually by human development like roads or agriculture, is the deliberate creation of habitat corridors. These are essentially protected linear pathways of suitable habitat that are designed to connect those previously isolated patches. The idea is to allow for the necessary dispersal of individuals between patches. Animals need to move. This movement promotes gene flow, reducing the risks of inbreeding, and helps ensure the long-term viability of a larger, healthier metapopulation, which is really just a network, a system of interconnected local populations functioning more like a single unit.
Okay. That rigorous, science-based focus on ensuring ecological viability. It stands in pretty stark contrast sometimes to the often relentless, sometimes unforgiving engine of the global economy. Let's pivot now and look at the human cost of viability, or maybe the pressures against it, within what some sources call the workaholic economy. This is an economic system fundamentally driven, of course, by capitalism and significantly accelerated by globalization. And it seems to place an absolutely extreme premium on constant productivity and measurable output, which for the human workforce involved often translates directly into things like mandatory overtime, ever-increasing workloads, and pressure to be always on.
And the irony there is just palpable, isn't it? We've experienced decades of radical technological innovation. We have levels of automation that previous generations could only dream of, things that should theoretically liberate us from toil. Yet quite often, those very efficiencies seem to simply ratchet up the expectations. They increase the demand for even faster output, quicker turnaround times, leading directly to the negative human costs that the sources clearly define. Things like widespread burnout, chronic overwork, mental health strain. The central dilemma, maybe the paradox, of this modern economy seems to be the near impossibility for many people of achieving genuine, sustainable work-life balance despite all the tech.
Right. And to link this back to our theme of resource management and viability, let's analyze tourism for a moment. On one hand, it's clearly a vital revenue stream for countless regions around the world, and it often functions as a powerful economic multiplier. The money tourists spend gets respent locally by businesses and employees, amplifying its overall economic impact.
But tourism is just such a classic sustainability challenge. It walks a very fine line. If it's managed poorly, if the primary drive is just short-term profit, it can lead incredibly quickly to the commercialization and, frankly, the commodification of unique cultural sites or fragile natural environments, turning them into just products to be consumed. Now, ecotourism models, they attempt to counteract this by prioritizing conservation, local community benefits, and environmental stewardship, often through stringent regulation and certification.
Yeah. But the danger is always there, isn't it? Uncontrolled growth inevitably leads to overcrowding, physical environmental degradation, eroding paths, polluting water, displacing wildlife, and eventually it can create a really dangerous economic dependency on that single, often volatile tourism sector. If the tourist traffic suddenly dries up due to a recession, a natural disaster, a pandemic, or if the very environment that attracted them is destroyed by the impact of tourism itself, well, there's very little economic resilience left if local governments or communities fail to achieve proper revenue diversification along the way.
And we see that exact same tension, that interplay between economic necessity and ecological fragility, pushed to an incredible logistical extreme in the practice of migratory apiculture. Commercial beekeeping.
Yes. This is just an incredible feat of modern agricultural logistics when you think about it. We're talking about millions upon millions of beehives being loaded onto trucks and moved hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles across the country, timed precisely to pollinate specific crops.
Exactly. This entire industry relies completely on synchronizing the movement of these hives with plant phenology. That's the precise timing of natural cycles, like when specific crops come into bloom and start producing nectar flow. This allows commercial beekeepers to fulfill massive contract pollination agreements with farmers, ensuring or maximizing the agricultural yield of crops that depend on insect pollination, like almonds, apples, berries, a huge part of our food supply.
But this extreme level of specialization and movement must introduce some severe stressors and biological constraints on the bee colonies themselves.
It absolutely does. It introduces at least 3 major viability threats to the bees. First, there's the constant biological threat from pests and diseases, particularly the infamous varroa mite. It's a devastating parasite that requires expensive, continuous intervention and chemical treatments to manage. Second, the sheer act of moving millions of hives around concentrates them and risks rapid pathogen spread between colonies and across regions. This necessitates strict biosecurity protocols, cleaning equipment, monitoring for disease to try and prevent devastating epidemics. And third, these migratory hives are very often placed in vast monoculture environments, enormous fields containing just a single crop, like almonds in California. This severely limits the bees' dietary diversity, potentially weakening their immune systems. And perhaps even more damagingly, it exposes them directly to potentially high concentrations of pesticide drift from spraying operations in those intensely farmed landscapes.
Wow.
All of these factors, pests, disease, poor nutrition, chemical exposure, contribute significantly to the ongoing problem of colony losses, sometimes called colony collapse disorder or more generally colony depopulation.
What a fantastic, if slightly alarming, parallel. The agricultural innovation of large-scale migratory beekeeping created undeniable abundance in certain crops. But simultaneously, it introduced these massive new biological dependencies and ecological constraints. Constraints that now require incredibly complex, energy-intensive global logistics just to maintain the basic biological and economic viability of the entire system. Wow. Okay, so we've really traveled an immense distance conceptually today. From, rubbing 2 sticks together to generate heat, all the way using complex computer models to predict the survival rate of the Iberian lynx. If we try to distill all 5 of these diverse areas, fire, archaeology, subterranean homes, human physiology, conservation, economics, beekeeping, is there a common fundamental mechanism that seems to be driving success, or at least persistence, across all of them?
I think there is. At its core, it seems to be about the efficient management and, crucially, the transformation of energy and resources in order to maximize some kind of desired yield. You could almost call it a unified field theory of survival and progress. Think about it. The yield of sparks from striking flint provides essential thermal energy. The yield of oxygen consumption, measured as VO2 max, provides sustained aerobic energy for movement. The clever yield of an architectural design manages environmental forces and utilizes thermal mass. And the agricultural yield of crops is fundamentally supported by the managed logistics of contract pollination. It's all about optimizing yield from available inputs.
Right. And the relentless pursuit of that better, more efficient yield seems to be driven consistently by innovation. It's the engine, whether it's the architectural innovation of a cantilever structure that allows for greater verticality in space, or the slow neurological adaptation leading to laterality for greater manual dexterity, or the conservation innovation represented by PVA modeling and the design of habitat corridors. Innovation really does appear to be the primary engine of transformation.
And to maybe crystallize this interconnectedness of structure, process, and outcome, we could use the analogy of glass manufacturing. It's a process we've touched upon before, but let's focus on its core material properties and how they seem to mirror the essential requirements of the complex systems we've just discussed.
That's a great analogy. Glass is a perfect example of material that undergoes controlled structural transformation to achieve specific properties.
Exactly. So first, think about transparency and refraction. The ability of glass to let light through clearly and bend it predictably. This represents the need for clarity, for seeing things accurately, understanding the true dynamics of the system you're dealing with. This is the kind of clarity we seek in establishing archaeological context, or the meticulous sensitivity analysis that's required within a PVA model to see all the potential risk factors clearly before you act. You need transparency.
Okay, transparency first. Then you obviously need strength, the ability to withstand pressure, to endure.
Absolutely. That's the inherent durability and potentially the engineered reinforcement of the glass. Its ability to resist stress and impact. This is the direct structural equivalent of a skyscraper's required integrity, or an elite athlete's physiological, hormonal balance, and metabolic resilience under extreme exertion. The system, whatever it is, must be strong enough, robust enough to withstand both internal and external stresses without failing.
Right. Transparency, durability, and finally, the process itself, how it's made, how it's maintained. That seems crucial for long-term viability, too.
That's where we look at the process of annealing in glassmaking. This is the meticulous, highly controlled heating and subsequent slow cooling process that's used to remove internal stresses and microscopic flaws from the glass. Stress is introduced during manufacturing. If you don't anneal it properly, the glass remains internally stressed and becomes incredibly brittle, prone to shattering unexpectedly later on. This careful stress removal, this annealing, is a direct analogy, I think, for the necessity of adaptive management and conservation, constantly monitoring and adjusting strategies. Or, on a personal level, the ongoing search for sustainable work-life balance within that demanding workaholic economy we discussed. You have to actively manage the internal stresses within the system, whatever the system is, to maintain its long-term sustainability and function. So clarity, transparency, strength, durability, and careful stress management, annealing, that seems to be the fundamental formula for achieving luminosity, effectiveness, and continued function across almost any complex system we look at. So we've seen today, I think quite clearly, that viability, simply continuing to exist and function effectively, is the ultimate universal goal. Whether we're talking about a threatened species on the brink, a billion-dollar architectural marvel, or even just a personal career trajectory. And we understand perhaps more deeply now that while innovation constantly provides the solutions to existing problems and constraints, it almost invariably creates new, often more complex, dependencies that must then be managed. Dependencies on electricity, on global supply chains, on specialized knowledge, on pollination logistics. So here's a final question for you, the listener, to maybe mull over after this deep dive. If we accept that structural integrity is absolutely essential for a skyscraper's physical endurance, and that efficient fat oxidation is key for an endurance athlete's biological resilience, what do you think is the fundamental, truly not negotiable mechanism that determines the long-term sustainability of your own personal work-life balance in this relentless, complex, and constantly innovation-driven world we all inhabit?